Expand your mind, don't let it wither and die. You'll find that it lifts your spirits high to the sky. So meditate.
So let's start off and just, I was curious because I find it that people are often have different motivations in life. And I was just curious, like, what got you into wanting to get into medicine as a career?
So I always have been very ethically minded, even when I was a child. That was something that was very strong in me. And I also loved biology and I loved people. And at the end of the day, I remember I was in college actually, and I had to decide, am I going to be a doctor or an actress? And I had to make that decision. It was a hard decision because I'd always loved performing. But at the end of the day, I said, okay, I just kind of sat down one afternoon or one morning and I was like, all right, if I become a doctor, I can go to work every day and help someone. That's a guarantee. If I become an actress, I don't have that guarantee. And then I get to be with people and help them, and it's science, and I get to make money and be able to help my family out. That was kind of like where my thinking was. But the overarching idea is I need to show up to work every day and have a guarantee that I can help someone, multiple people. It just made the answer so much easier for me. Now, of course, I know over time, though, I ended up pursuing both. And you can't deny the various facets of yourself. You know what I mean?
That's true.
But that's how I ended up deciding to become a doctor. And I ended up getting my master's in public health from UC Berkeley. Ended up getting another master's in health and medical sciences from UC Berkeley. And I got my medical degree from UCSF. These are all top schools in the nation for anybody who doesn't know. So I worked really hard. I was a girl to begin with, and here I am now.
So let's also set the stage just a little bit before we dive into the conversation. Can you kind of go over your, first of all, you have several titles. Can you kind of go over what those are and what it entails educationally and training wise to kind of attain those?
Sure. So I have my MD and I have a master's in public health, my MPH, and I also have a master's in health and medical sciences. So for the MD, vast majority of people finish their undergraduate degree. And I majored in molecular cell developmental biology, which is kind of like the hard major, right? But it was fascinating because now I have an understanding of molecular biology and thinking about like when we discuss these vaccines and that my thinking and understanding of them on a molecular level and seeing it picture-wise in my head, I have that facility that maybe other people don't. But you could go to medical school studying history, for example. And so I studied molecular cell developmental biology. I did my undergrad at UCLA. I graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and I got highest departmental honors in molecular biology. And then I applied to med school. I gotten into this 5-year program. Med school is usually 4 years long. But I, being the overachiever, I decided to do a 5-year program that was really focused on training humanistic physician leaders called the UC Berkeley UCSF Joint Medical Program. So I did my preclinical years at UC Berkeley in a group of 12 people, including myself, very intimate. And then I went to UCSF and did my clinical years, 2 years there, and I got my medical degree from UCSF. Along the way, I said, I really love studying individual health and understanding how to help the individual. But I had these bigger questions, like what causes disease, overall? Why does someone get sick and someone doesn't? And how do we affect change on a larger population level? So I was at Berkeley already. So I said, I'm going to apply for the MPH program. So I did, got my public health degree and started learning and studying about the factors that caused morbidity and mortality nationally, internationally, and then how to create programs and what are the pitfalls that historically we've done in looking at public health, creating public health programs and looking at it from a level of not just like how do you make a successful program, but how do you make it sustainable? How do you make it ethical? How do you make it fiscally responsible? Kind of studied all that stuff. And then after my, I also got another master's in health and medical sciences from UC Berkeley. That was part of my medical program. And I looked at the sexual health of Latino adolescents and their self-efficacy. And I then went off to finish my clinical years at UCSF. So much work. I ended up going to Africa and did some research in trachoma. And I had, I think, at least one kid during that time. And then I went off to internship. I did an internship at a level 1 trauma hospital, Highland Hospital. It was really intense. Got to see very sick people, but also you got to help these very sick people. It was awesome. And what a privilege that was. And got to really understand how socioeconomic factors and our past histories really affect our health. And also how at a certain point, the physician is kind of powerless in the system because there's so many other factors. So at a certain point, I felt like I was just kind of putting a Band-Aid on the problem, right? And I did see some revolving patients. That was really sad. And then, of course, you see the gunshots and the traumas as well. And then I decided to do my residency in ophthalmology. So after internship, I went to ophthalmology at UC Irvine. I served as chief resident at UC Irvine's ophthalmology program. I had another baby at that time, and making it work and doing it, and had great surgical training there. Got to take care of all sorts of diseases, infectious, genetic, and looking at the interaction of how disease manifests. There's a lot of problems that manifest in the eye that are actually systemic diseases like diabetes, like hypertension, cancers. So that was fascinating and it was really fulfilling. And then I went off to UC San Diego and I did a 2-year vitreoretinal fellowship. So, when I look back to answer your question, it's a lot of training, a lot of studying, a lot of intensity. I think when you're that young and you're that driven and you're that motivated and your personality is kind of like that, and you kind of have a path you can follow, which I think we can hit upon, like people who choose medicine often like having a path. If you just do A, B, C, D, it's really hard, but you have to do these things and you're almost guaranteed a job unless you really mess up. So that was also, so I just followed that path. I worked intensely hard and achieved a lot. And now here I am.
Well, that sounds very exhausting. That's a lot.
It's not, I don't think it's healthy. I think for the vast majority of people, it's incredibly toxic to the system. The system is sick. Medical training is sick. People don't live balanced lives in training. And they've tried to do interventions to reduce the work hours, workloads. They're working on it. But I think, we need more voices just to go out and say, this is crazy. It's the upside down. Like you're trying to promote health, but your trainees are working in sick, unhealthy environments, and their lives are generally most of the time pretty unhealthy too.
Well, yeah, it's I always find it interesting to have a health official get on television to give me health advice that is there, and they're obviously, severely overweight, or they're not clearly not in the tip top of health, and I always find that very interesting. When we can get more into that later, because but I think you set it up very well, because there is a sort of systemic problem, at least from the perspective of I thought for the longest time, one of the principles of medicine, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is one of the things a layman might think, at least, is that the first principle is to do no harm, and to kind of go from there into making people, healthier and better and so forth. But there are obviously a lot of issues with our traditional healthcare system, insurance companies. But I think the one that's really kind of come to the forefront right now has been pharmaceutical companies, and just the vast influence that they seem to have. Because, like, a good example of this is I've heard that, you know, they claim that they have to charge all these prices for because of research and development that goes into them. But then I also hear from the flip side that, well, a lot of these drugs are also developed by government subsidies or through other programs, and then the pharmaceutical companies just kind of come in and take them to market, basically. You know, I hear about, you know, recalls. I mean, throughout, not just recently, but just throughout the decades, there's been how many recalls on drugs that have went to market and came back, and there's lawsuits that come out of it. I've even heard, and, you know, I know it's very complex with the data, but the way they sort of handle trial data and it's kind of like, from my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is kind of like the company conducts the trials, and then they give a summary of that to the oversight committee, to the oversight board, whoever it is that oversees them. But they keep all the raw data. So whoever's overseeing them really doesn't have a true picture of what that data is. It can be a you know, kind of an influenced, you know, a biased, I guess you could say, report that they're actually looking at on those things. Do I understand that sort of correctly? And
sure. And I don't know all the intricacies of the FDA requirements for different pharmaceutical, you know, for the pharmaceutical companies, but I know it is supposed to be a very rigorous process. That said, there's a lot of things that we need to understand in terms of the interrelationships between pharma and government. Just kind of looking at it from a macro level, we need a lot more transparency in terms of what data is released and what data isn't, what data they keep back, right? They don't necessarily, if something doesn't work, they're not going to present it to the government and be like, hey, it didn't work for this or this. So there's data that we don't see, right? Which one can argue, well, that's their own private business. They could be able to keep it. But actually, I think for our medicine, we need to have very high transparency standards. And then there's like the incentivization of people in government who want to maybe ultimately leave government and get a higher paying job in pharma. We need to look at and to see how that may play out in how the relationship between pharma and governments manifest in terms of these companies becoming more successful because the people in government are maybe incentivized to maybe go work for these people. So they have to keep this relationship lubricated. And what gets you know, a pass and what doesn't, in terms of like if something didn't you know, if the rule wasn't followed exactly correctly, or maybe there was a gray area, maybe they get a pass. Like, these are things that we need to become a lot more savvy about, and a lot more we need more transparency on. And then there's also just the vast, I think, looking at it from a larger perspective, like the fact that we are so dependent on chemicals that are man-made or that are you know, discovered and then in nature and then altered a little bit so that chemical can then become something that's marketable. And how much there's so much money behind creating something that is not that is a chemical that's kind of lab made or just slightly altered from nature. And that's kind of the profit model under which we live, that we can't actually have anything. There's not a huge incentive for us to study molecules that are and chemicals that are in nature. And it's all about, well, how do we create something in the lab or alter it slightly so that we can then sell it for a profit? That creates a lot of problems too, because then the natural things don't get studied. There's so many issues. There's so many problems. Yeah. That's one silver lining of COVID, right? To be able to have greater conversations about these things, I think is so important.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's a reason why our healthcare in this country in the United States is rather expensive. And, you know, you mentioned something very interesting there with how politicians transition into lobbyists or onto boards. And it truthfully, it doesn't just happen in the healthcare system. It happens in all industries. It just so happens that I think it's becoming more clear how influential and how much money pharmaceutical kind of puts into these efforts. And I also have found it always very interesting and a little bit probably just perverse in some regard that we allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise on TV the way they do here. It's always such a weird commercial. It's very, I always feel like it's a little misleading. You know, it's like a very tranquil, picturesque image. And then at the end, it's all, half the commercial is listing potential side effects that sound more terrible than having dry skin to me.
Oh, yeah. They look super happy. And it's an art to making that kind of commercial. My understanding is that there are production companies that their only job is to make that type of commercial. They only focus on pharma commercials. So there are regulations about it. But yeah, they make the picture so wonderful. And you don't even have that problem. You're like, I want that life. I want to be like having dinner on the veranda with my family, drinking my glass of, Chardonnay and enjoying myself. Like, yeah, I want that pharma life. It starts getting into your subconscious as like a way of being like, okay. Whereas I, as a physician, my goal has always been minimize the number of interventions as much as possible, get to the person and get to the person's system in a place where the system can try to be self-sustaining as much as possible. Right. But the commercial makes it like you're lulled, especially because they slow-mo, right? You watch all these commercials, everything like at a certain point, the person's talking and then you see them interacting with their family, everything's in slow-mo. Hey, like it's done for a reason, people. It's there to change your mind regarding the product. And they don't show the downsides of it, right? They don't show the person having a horrible Stevens-Johnson's reaction to the product that they're selling and like being in the hospital in the burn unit. They don't show that. They show the beautiful, tranquil dinner on the veranda. Not that their issue is under control, but they don't show and the other side effect. So that's the opposite of what like a thoughtful discussion in your doctor's office, talking about the pros and the cons, and also other options that you could do, right? That's what we need. So it's really problematic in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I don't mind. I understand the advertising game when you're trying to get me to buy a new shirt or, something that's strictly commercial consumerism. But when you're and let's be honest, advertising in a sense, if you see something repetitive enough, it's a sense of brainwashing. And, I don't know that I want to be convinced that I need to go to my doctor and ask them if I need this. I kind of have always thought about medicine as being like, my doctor will tell me what I need for me personally, because I'm an individual and I'm very different. And not this should have the same treatments necessarily for the same illnesses or same ailments. I don't know. Do you think there's any path to ever getting advertising away from pharmaceutical here?
I don't really know the history of how we got here when it became, I think it was like my understanding. I just listened to an interview last night where they were saying it was like made okay in the 1980s, but don't quote me on that. So I imagine there was a lot of lobbying done, a lot of money behind that. So to change that would need a lot of public activism and probably a lot of money or tons of boots on the ground to try to get it changed. Conversations like this to promote awareness are really, really good too, like to just at least get that conversation started, because eating food that didn't have pesticides in it wasn't like a thing 30 years ago, but it is much more now. So I think we can maybe change the mind of the consumer too. There's another tangential issue that I think is, or related, which is that, you said, I want my doctor to tell me these things, but there's another huge problem, which is now doctors, again, I was telling you the Band-Aid, right? It's like, I'm kind of like trying to control the situation. And with the fact that the insurance companies are incentivized to pay doctors less and less, and the doctors are trying to be competitive in the marketplace. So they're taking the lower insurance rates because everybody else is. And so now that's why you get like a 7-minute office visit, right? Because that's That's how they can still maintain their income. What can you do in 7 minutes? Not much. Take this pill. The woman comes in. I'm feeling bad. I'm low energy. I don't feel like anybody is really listening to me. I'm just low and I feel worthless. Take this pill. Take this pill. Take this pill. And that's why 25% of women in their 40s and 50s are on an antidepressant.
I'm surprised it's not higher.
A quarter of women in their 40s and 50s are on an antidepressant because the medical model is so sick that it is not getting to the root cause of disease.
Yeah. And, you know, this is something that has sort of bothered me about the last little bit, because things that I always thought were sort of settled science have all of a sudden become debatable in a completely different way, that now the opposite has become, you know, the term I think was believe the science, or something to that effect. But it had changed, and I see it continuing to change. And, you know, you talk about doctors recommending things now, and, you know, I see things like the LA school system, you know, not too long ago had someone that did a video about proper nutrition in for the school system. And it was, you know, talking about food neutrality, and food choices are based on false standards of health. And, you know, I'm not saying that we haven't reevaluated some of the things in the food pyramid or whatever you want to reference to. But then you see just a couple of weeks ago on 60 Minutes, this was Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, I think, from it was the White House advisor to Biden on health or something to that effect. And, you know, she, you know, comes on and basically refers to obesity as a brain disease, and that doctors don't understand obesity. And that she did, you know, she also advises these companies that are developing these medications. Like I think the most recent one is now a shot that they've just recommended for kids, semaglutide, or I don't know what the brand name is for it, but I think that's the non-official name for it. And I just don't understand why especially during a time when everyone was reflecting on their health, why there wasn't more of a message on the things that we know are true, which is, if you exercise a little bit, you don't have to exercise a lot. If you eat well, like, you know, I know people, and I agree with you 100%. Pesticide free would be really the best way to go for your food sources. But even people, I go to the store and just making the simple choice between, you know, the snack food and chip aisle versus the meat and vegetables, or the meat and, you know, eggs. There's choices that are made in the stores that I feel like people need to hear that message, and instead they're just being told, look, you're not to blame for anything. Just take this shot, take this pill, and it'll just solve everything for you. And I just feel like that's a bit of a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite, who is going around telling people that they're not to blame for anything? I mean, I don't even like the idea of blame. So, you know, I like the idea of taking charge of your life. I like the idea of taking some responsibility for yourself. The blame game, especially because so many people, I feel, have a lot of hangups and triggers with shame and guilt. I don't like that idea. You know, it just from the word, saying that word, I don't think it's as helpful. But the idea of empowering people and letting them take personal responsibility and being like, this is what's in your control. This is what's not in your control. Let's focus on what's in your control. And you actually have a lot more control than you think. And you can make huge changes in your life. I mean, I have made huge changes in my life by taking some responsibility for myself and not living in like a sense of victimhood. I haven't seen anybody who's saying that like you're not to blame at all for any of your problems with regard to your weight or your obesity. I'd love to see who's saying that. But I think the idea that we can take responsibility and we do have control is something that's really lacking in our mainstream narratives. It's almost as if you do say, take some responsibility, or you have so much power, then you think that you're automatically avoiding things that need to be looked at, because it is true. It's the advertising for food, the food stuffs that we do get in the stores, the food scientists who are actively working to make foods more addictive, right? These are all true. And so in a way, there is some stuff that's just like social media is being made to be more addictive. Just like those commercials, those farmer commercials almost make you kind of mollified, or just kind of entranced by the idea of taking them. There is something to be said for that. But I think the only way we can get out of it is for people to start taking personal responsibility. And in taking personal responsibility, then their sphere of influence increases, and they can start changing making changes on a more systemic level with these other problems, and putting attention on the fact that food scientists are actively manipulating the food to make it more addictive to your taste buds, right? Or to your brain. As far as the question of obesity being a brain-only disease, I'm really confused by that statement, because that just doesn't make any sense when you think about physical metabolism, when you think about muscles burning calories or utilizing energy, right? The mind body is actually one system. We separate it, but it's actually one beautiful system. It's easier to think about it separately as a mind and a body, but it's one thing, right? And it's a very delicate, complex, nuanced system. So if we just say obesity is just a brain disease is it's too simplistic. It doesn't even make sense. There are so many things about obesity we don't understand and we don't know, right? But for example, I think there's some research that shows that if your family 3 generations ago had some food scarcity, right? People you haven't even seen 3 generations ago had food scarcity, that your genes 3 generations later are changed such that you are more likely to hold on to energy, even if you're following the same diet as other people around you. So what that means is, in a way, it's kind of not in your control how much energy your body is going to be holding on to, because 3 generations ago, your family went through famine. Yeah, that's good to know. It's good to understand. It may be that's why I'm 10 pounds weigh 10 pounds more. Possibly that's why I weigh 10 pounds more than my friend, and we eat the same things. Maybe my body type is just that way. At the same time, that doesn't mean that you give up and you don't exercise and you don't eat clean and right. Do the stuff that's in your control. Don't overeat. Eat when you're. What my favorite dietitian says: eat when you're 2, stop when you're 7. Right. That's mindful eating, and eat good amount of protein and fats, some carbs too, and get great physical exercise, and your weight will go where it needs to be. And that may be 10 pounds more than somebody else. That's okay, because we don't understand all the things about weight. And act like we do is really, really has lots of hubris in that, right? To think that we know everything, that it's only a brain disease, please.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and I know a lot of people, myself, I have, experience with, how it can be genetic, certain genetic predispositions can occur. But, when it comes down to it, I think it's, at least from my perspective, maybe this is too simple, but it's simple math. If you consume more than you're expending, you're going to start to gain a little bit. And if you're, expending more than you're consuming, you're going to start to lose a little bit. And you can kind of dictate that rate to some extent. I would also throw one more key thing that I've been shocked at, and recently have just heard some interesting reports on is the sugar industry, and just that's, to me, is one of the key things. If somebody just wants to starting point in their diet, it's unbelievable how bad and how much sugar is in most people's diet. I don't think they're aware of it at all.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite psychologists, who happens to be a close friend of mine, told me, she said, sugar is a substitute for love. So whenever you're craving sugar, right? Think about where you're missing, and kind of love is the meta word for like good feeling, caring, nurturing. So if you're craving sugar, is it because you're actually craving a nurturing and you need to give yourself some self-nurturing because this happened to me once. Your daughter, gave you attitude, and you turn around and you automatically, your first thing in your mind is, I want to go eat some dried mango. And I stopped myself and I was like, why? Why do I want dried mango this second? And I realized it's because she was rude and my brain wanted to make me feel better. So it turned to, let's feel better. Let's go have some dried mango. And I stopped myself. Again, that goes back to the mindful eating. But that was a really beautiful example of how sugar is a substitute for love. It's a substitute for connection. It's a substitute for joyous feeling. And those are things that we can cultivate in ourselves. But instead, we, even in our family systems, have cultivated this belief that in order to feel good, you need to eat sugar, right? What do? We celebrate birthdays and we're just saying, hey, have some cake. And I'm not against cake. I love cake, right? But it's really interesting to think about that kind of way of thinking about sugar as being a substitute for love.
Yeah, it really feels like, you can be. Everybody has certain preferences, certainly, and people are certainly certain people are probably more inclined to have addictions than others. But I think with a little bit of insight, you can at least pick healthy addictions. And you could be addicted to sugar, to unhealthy eating, to hardcore drugs and alcohol and things like that. But it's all a choice. And, sometimes I just feel like people they're either not informed, which is possible when I think about the school systems, but, I also feel like there's so much information out there that there's just a lack of discipline by most people to make that conscious choice as well.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people aren't taught that by their families, or most people aren't taught about eating mindfully. Right? Their parents are mostly overeating anyway. Let's face it. Most people's parents are overeating. There's like snacks everywhere, right? The reason those supermarkets carry those foods is because people buy them.
I mean, even home cooked food. I can remember growing up, my mother cooked a lot and it was really good food. But growing up, I could never figure out why I was never as lean as my friends. Not that I was overweight, but I was just never super lean. And sure enough, as soon as I moved out and started eating more, what I thought was better for me, it changed pretty.
Wow. Coming since I'm a woman and I have that like more of a feminine maternal facet to myself, I do feel that a lot of times when you give food to a child, right, and you're feeding, that's like your love language to show that you care to that person, right? Eat, have a second helping. I made this great food, eat it. I'm not really hungry. What do you mean you're not hungry? Like I made this, go ahead, eat it. It makes the mother feel good when the child is eating the food. And so then there's even a subconscious behavioral force to get people to connect around food. And that's something, that's subconscious baggage to let go of, right? To eat with enjoyment, but not to only eat, but to find enjoyment only in eating, or to find connection and love only in eating. That's something I think women can, or just people who enjoy feeding other people, can also become more aware of.
Yeah, I think it goes even maybe deeper than that, because I grew up in the Southeast, and I've traveled around quite a bit, and it definitely is, I think, culturally ingrained in a lot of communities as well. Like it's sort of the expected thing. I mean, when I go home now, I clearly am not eating enough, and every get together is it's almost always around food based to some extent. And so I think there's a lot of existing cultural expectations and traditions that have to be overcome as well. And that can go deep,
Yeah. Absolutely. Matthew, I totally know what you're talking about. My family's from Iran. We're like Persian, right? We're like the hosts, right? You come, you don't even know the person. You invite them to their house and you feed them.
Absolutely.
And that's beautiful. And that's wonderful, right? I'm not saying to like stop that, right? But to not make it the only way to connect, not make it the only way to tell the person that you care about them, or the only way to find joy as a family is only around the food, right? So to just be together. There's something really beautiful about cultivating that connection and that love together without other things around. Yeah. Gosh, I thought I was just going to come here and talk about medical freedom and medical censorship, but we've gotten deep already.
Well, yeah. Well, we're about to get to all that, because I think that leads into what we've been talking about, which is, knowing where to get good information, knowing where you can find information that's going to work for you. Because I think that's also something that I've always thought leading up to this, at least to the last few years, is that, healthcare is a bit of an individualized thing. And I by no means have any fancy medical degrees, but I took a few science courses in college. And so I have some real basic understandings, even though it's been many years now, enough to understand that what I felt like I was hearing wasn't exactly the science that I should be trusting, even though they were saying it was the science to trust. And so it really led me to a point where, like, who do we turn to and who do we trust? And it was more troublesome to me when I saw this AB 2098 coming up in California, because it was, to my understanding, at this point, they were taking it a step further. The last couple of years, it felt like there was a lot of coercion and influence and pressure on healthcare officials to give a particular set of information or perspective on information. But it was still up to professionals, healthcare professionals. They still had the ability to give differing information for a particular individual based on their particular health situation. Mm-hmm. And from my understanding of AB 2098 was that this would basically take that right away. It would punish and penalize physicians for for giving recommendations to their patients that would be contradictory to the established line of thinking, I guess you could say. Do I have that kind of understood correctly?
Well, I think you're underlying the dangers very well. So AB 2098 was a bill that was introduced this last bill cycle by the Assembly, and it passed both through the Assembly and the Senate. California has a bicameral legislature, and it was part of a slew of bad bills that was put forth by mostly members of this vaccine working group made up of legislators as well as two legislators who were doctors. And they saw this COVID as an opportunity to create solutions that they thought were important to do. For example, creating a vaccine registry for the whole state of California, so the government knows exactly who's vaccinated against what, when, where. As well as lowering the age of consent. They wanted to lower the age of consent for vaccination to 12 years old, so kids could get it done in school or without their parents' knowledge. They used that. The Scott Wiener, who was the person who wrote that bill, was saying that this was going to empower children, right? Forget about families and empowering the parent-child connection. We just want to empower kids to do whatever they want. It's ridiculous. Fortunately,
how can a minor? I don't understand that either. How if they're not able to vote and they have to have parents' permission to do almost everything else, how can a 12-year-old give consent to know what the right medical decision? How do they have enough understanding to make that decision?
Oh, well, I think that's a very logical question. And I think that there's many people in the legislature who don't have that level of logic that you do, right? Obviously, the brain of a child is very different than the brain of an adult. obviously children need to have the wise guidance of wise family members, wise mentors to help them reach to a state of wise adulthood. Obviously, a parent should know what's happening medically to their child. So if the child ends up having a horrible seizure in the middle of the living room, the parent knows exactly what's going on and has is not like clueless to the fact that their child got a medical procedure that afternoon, right? These are obvious things, but they use the idea of like children who are at risk and whose parents don't care about them as necessitating the reason for that law. Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, if you're worried about at-risk kids who are being neglected by their family, why don't you make a law specifically for at-risk kids who are being neglected by their family and not this blanket law? They had an agenda. They knew exactly what they were doing. I started, and then there was also AB 2098. This law was, fortunately, that law didn't get passed, the 12-year-old age of consent law, but AB 2098 did. And what this law says is it says, with regard to COVID, any doctor who spreads disinformation or misinformation, and we'll get into the definitions in a little bit, any doctor who spreads misinformation or disinformation with regard to COVID can have their license and be investigated. And one of the possibilities is have their license taken away, right? So the Medical Board of California, there's also the Osteopathic Board of California. They are the ones who license doctors, and it's to keep the public safe from really bad apples, really bad characters who are being, irresponsible, doing horrible things, alcoholic who's, drunk on the job, someone who's doing procedures but not really doing them, just pretending to do them, things like that, like real unethical wackos. But the way they wrote this law made it so they could go after anybody who didn't follow the mainstream consensus viewpoints held by people in the legislature, especially the Democrats, held by the public health officials. In general, in the past, doctors have had a lot of leeway with what they can do, like you were saying, Matthew, what they could do for certain patients. And I say, well, I don't actually think this treatment would be good for patient X, but I do think that but I understand that the general thinking is that this procedure is good for everybody. But I think for patient X, you're very sensitive. You've had some medical reactions to other drugs. So let's just let your system rest for a little bit. Let's not do it. But we can't do that anymore. With this law, if what they were trying to do is they were trying to say any doctor who speaks out against and gives a view that's not consensus opinion publicly, that they can get their license taken away. And then all of a sudden, someone pointed out to them, oh, actually, that's a First Amendment thing. You can't go after people in America if they're saying things in public. So then they said, oh, we can't do that? All right, fine. We'll change it to just only the patient-doctor relationship. But you can see what the intention of the law was. The intention of the law was to chill the speech of public speech of doctors. But then they just said, okay, we're going to go between the patient and the doctor relationship. And if a doctor gives that patient misinformation or disinformation, they can have their license taken away. And I read the definition of misinformation, Matthew, and I got so disturbed. Multiple reasons. First of all, it didn't make grammatical sense, right? You want to have a law be clear. And I was like, this is like a word salad, their definition of misinformation. It was, misinformation was defined as false information contradicted by contemporary scientific consensus, contrary to standard of care. And I was like, this doesn't make grammatical sense. It's vague. It's dangerous just by the fact that it's vague. And consensus, as a doctor, I've gone against consensus. Why can't I go against consensus? Plenty of doctors go against consensus. I had a severe illness, Matthew, that changed my life, by the way, and made me awaken to like new paradigms and ways of thinking about health and our systems and how toxic they were. But in that journey, I, as a patient, went against consensus. I chose some doctors who went against consensus, and they were kind of like discussing back and forth what they should do, right? So that word was very dangerous to me. Why is the government trying to make doctors only follow consensus? And so I started speaking out against the law or the bill, and I met with my representatives. I just started becoming an activist in my bedroom. And when it looked like the bill was going to get signed into law by the governor, that's when I really got very concerned. And because I'd been speaking out, right, you take action and there's reactions that come at you, the opportunities open, right? So the positive reaction was that this opportunity opened for me to be part of a lawsuit against the state of California and the Medical Board of California that sued the governor and the medical board for infringing on our First Amendment rights to free speech as physicians and for me as a patient because of my history. And also our 14th Amendment right to due process, because the law is so vague. You have to have like a person of average intelligence to be able to understand it. And we argued that it doesn't make sense. And when you read the state's response to our lawsuit, you just see how aggressive and I'm trying to find a nice word and not use a mean word. How aggressive and ill-advised and unwise their methods of making arguments for the necessity of this law are. And they try to find any excuse to try to weasel their way out of the very valid arguments that this law doesn't make sense. They tried to say, oh, these people don't have standing to bring this lawsuit. They tried to say, oh, this law is very clear. They tried to say, well, they can do whatever they want. I mean, you have leeway, right? But they weren't getting at the fact that the words of the law were going to pigeonhole doctors into feeling like they could only say what the mainstream consensus was. And I already knew, Matthew, before this law was put in place, that doctors were showing their speech. Because not the private practice, they say, is dying. I hope it's not. But like a lot of doctors are now working for corporate like entities. And when you have that type of job, don't tell me that you're not going to be incentivized to keep your mouth shut at work instead of speaking out and like having a rally for patient rights and for ethics and medicine. No, you're just going to be like, whatever I need to do to put food on my table and keep my job, right? So that's why I already knew my friends, their speech was being chilled. People were texting me. They were sending me DMs. I'm so glad you're speaking out. Free speech in America has gotten so bad. These are doctors saying this to me. And then with the passage of this law, it would chill their speech more. Some of my friends were telling me, don't sign any exemption. Don't keep your mouth shut. I tell my patients, one of my friends said, I would like to tell you what I think, but I'm not allowed to. That's frightening. That's medical dystopia we're living in.
Well, that's the part of it that troubles me, because I am very different. I share genetics with my family, for example, but I'm a different person than any of them. And what, they get told for something is going to be very, how to treat it is going to be very different perhaps than how I would get told to treat it. And I wouldn't want to go to a doctor that's going to look at me and go, you're a 6 foot, male, and goes down a chart and just goes across the chart and is like, this is what I'm supposed to prescribe to you based on this and based on who you are, based on your demographics, based on your block in life or whatever. That's what's worrisome to me is I prefer, to have and admittedly, you may fuss at me for this, but I don't really go to the doctor unless I injure myself playing sports or something. But in general, when I do go, I still want a doctor that's going to, look at my individual case and feel free to tell me, and look, tell me what my options are, whatever they are. I'm fairly rational, and if we talk them through, I'm sure I'll make a decent choice. But I at least want to know what those options are. And it's interesting that you stated it that way too, because about the true target of this being the public voice. Because to me, it went in an even worse direction, because it started now, the direction it went affected the patient doctor, relationship. And it reminded me as well, because we are in a unique situation in the United States. And I think we should keep that in mind. I don't know if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, but right now he's going through an interesting situation with his own licensing and accreditation to practice in Canada. And Canada doesn't have the same protections necessarily that we do. It's a very interesting dynamic, as these governments all seem to be trending in this direction as well, which is troublesome.
I think Jordan Peterson's case and this case are two very clear examples of how free speech is under attack and how COVID is being used to promote decreased autonomy, increased authoritarianism, and decreased rights in America and Canada. I've been following what's been happening in Canada. It's really frightening. Countries that you thought were like, quote unquote, Western, right? Supposedly more civilized. They're under attack. Our free speech, our autonomy, our ability to make smart decisions for ourselves, for our bodies, is under attack. If the Nuremberg Code, the various documents that were signed, enshrined, saying that you have a right to do whatever you want to your body, are held up as examples of our civilized, things that we adhere to. But at the same time, we tell people, well, if you want to keep your federal job, or if you want to keep your job at all in Hollywood, in whatever industry that you're at, I said Hollywood because I'm part of the entertainment industry too. And my friends that have not been able to work because they were told you can't be part of a production because of a vaccine. It's they're being coerced to do this. I have so many of my friends who didn't want to get vaccinated, who felt like they were coerced because otherwise they would not be. That's not ethical. Let's not kid ourselves. That's not ethics, right? Bodily autonomy is very important. And so this is something that these two cases, Jordan Peterson, this case, there's other cases in Canada as well. And these are a sign of what's to come if we don't act now.
Yeah. You brought it up again. I know so many people, myself included, in some respects, that were, had to make difficult decisions as to whether or not to get vaccinated. And some people might be in a position where, they can be a little, maybe they're independent or whatever. But like you said, whether you're a doctor or any of these other companies and any of these other industries that were requiring this, it made a lot of average everyday people that don't have a lot of options financially to make a difficult decision. Do I risk my career path? Do I risk my financial stability to do what I think I need to do for me and my health, or do I just take it and roll the dice? And it's interesting. I guess I'm a little more, to let everybody do what they will. I personally, I think all drugs should be legal, and I'm a little more liberal with that perhaps than some, for sure. But I think it has to come down to personal choice as well. With these things, because my employer doesn't know my history with my health. They don't know something that may have happened when you were a kid or even 10 years ago. I don't know. It's just troublesome to me to see things. And I guess I would feel differently. I was like most kids when I was a child. I probably had the MMR, certain vaccines at the time. But they had been around a while as well. And I think that was also something that was a little bit concerning. I mean, admittedly, I'm one of those people that I'm not going to buy a car the first model year. I'm going to wait until they work out the bugs on it. And same thing with pretty much anything, to be quite honest. And so I think just as an aside to what you just said, one of my professors in my internship
told me, he said, I like to wait 7 years before a drug comes out before I start using it on my patients. And I said, well, why 7 years? He said, that's how long it usually takes for the problems to show up. I was like, oh my gosh. Right. And then you see this roll out with this vaccine super fast. Now they say, the really acute problems you're going to see within a couple of weeks. But of course, we now see that there's other long-term issues that can show up. But anyway, you were saying, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, let's keep going down that road, because that's something I don't fully understand, but I know there could be an issue with it. And that's with these heart conditions, especially with, it seems like younger high performance kind of athletes. And I don't understand that. Can you explain maybe what's happening there?
Yeah, I haven't reviewed the literature to be up to date on it for this conversation, but there's some thoughts that you can get subclinical myocarditis and inflammatory heart issues that can then cause arrhythmias. Or if the person was right, and then there's the concept of load, right? So maybe you have one insult and it doesn't show something up, and then you do something else that does the other, that further insults it, right? And then you have a manifestation of disease manifesting as a terrible arrhythmia leading to loss of consciousness or death, right? So these are things that we need to actually parse out and investigate further. The inflammatory nature of this vaccine compared to other vaccines. Quote unquote vaccine, right? I don't even know if I would define this as a vaccine. It's
like a treatment.
It's.
Or am I just?
Well, I mean, it's obviously it's a treatment. It's a very big umbrella term, but it's like, well, what is this exactly? It's using your body's cellular machinery to create a protein from an mRNA that gets inserted into the body. Which, by the way, we were told initially only went to one place and quickly degraded, but now we're finding that that's not true, which I was very surprised when my colleagues were going around saying that. And I would say to them, this is like the vaccine first got introduced. Like, why are you saying that? Like, there's no proof of that. If you don't have proof, you shouldn't be saying anything. You should say, I don't know. But people wanted security. They wanted to have a sense of like knowledge and feel like there was some stable ground upon which they were making these decisions. And so then they very quickly were like, oh yeah, it's going to get degraded very quickly. Or, oh yeah, it's only going to stay localized in that area. I scratched my head like, am I missing something? Because did I miss a report or something that got published that I didn't see? No, people were just talking out of not their mouths, somewhere else, making stuff up or following like group speak. Anyway, so now we're noticing the inflammatory nature of these vaccines, but I've gotten to this place where my colleagues and some of my co-plaintiffs, like, they're afraid to even say these things, right? Because the law was intended to go after, they say it in the law itself, AB 2198. Oh, if you speak out, against the efficacy of vaccines, that was like one of the things the reasons they cited for the reason for this law, like questioning vaccine efficacy or questioning vaccine, something like that. Don't quote me. But that's a problem, because then that makes people feel like they can't question science and can't question evidence that's there that they might interpret differently, or they might say, well, actually, we have these other questions. It's clearly that they want us to follow one directive, public health directive from the California Department of Public Health or the CDC, where in fact, like scientists, doctors, we're supposed to be constantly questioning, constantly like thinking, is this the right thing? Should we be vaccinating pregnant women? Should we wait 5 years before we do that? What are the long-term consequences? Should we study the long-term consequences before we inject children, right? But if laws like this get passed, you can't even ask these questions. To go back to the inflammatory nature of this vaccine, it's something that definitely needs to get studied. So there's a lot we don't know. It may be multifactorial. You may find out, if somebody had viral illness that maybe promoted some inflammation, then they get some other viral illness. And there's so many combinations of possibilities. We need to study them. We need to be curious. We need to ask. It's very sad.
Yeah. So what is the, in a day and time when transparency is very important to a lot of people, like what is why? It seems like if they wanted to alleviate a lot of this, they wouldn't be holding on to the data for so many years. What is that typical that you would, I mean, again, I'm just a layman. So I look at it and I'm like, well, that seems strange. They don't want to release the data on it for how long? 75 years or something?
50 something.
Yeah.
I don't know the full story on that, but they didn't want to release the data, or the FDA didn't want to release the data for like 50 something years.
Yeah. That seems, I don't know if that's typical, but that seems really suspect, I think, to an average person.
Yeah, I think even if it was typical, like with this situation, you should not be, because when there's already questioning and there's this urgency that's led people to do such policies that are infringing on people's freedoms and have led to coercive actions, you actually need to require more transparency. So it doesn't matter to me if this is standard or not. The situation is too urgent for us not to have that transparency. We need the truth out here so that we can start knowing what to do for ourselves and our children. If there are any long-term consequences or possibilities, then we need to start acting proactively now to prevent further health problems in the kids who have gotten vaccinated, and to find, you know what I mean, to preemptively like think about possibility. If there is some bad stuff, we need to like find solutions sooner rather than later. Not waste a generation of people before we get to the next generation. And in the meantime, the government wants to vaccinate every child, right? Like they put it on the vaccine schedule as a yearly thing, or they want to, or at least it was approved to get on the vaccine schedule as a yearly thing. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah, that's the other thing I think I didn't quite understand with the response to this. Look, I understand it spread very quickly and that a lot of people did die and a lot of people got sick. But I think I would have expected this kind of response more for something that had a much higher death rate, or had a death rate that was less targeted. I felt like this, I mean, maybe but my understanding of the overall numbers resulting out of this was that it mainly targeted older people were most hit. And, you know, obviously people that had pre-existing health conditions such as obesity, actually. But it really wasn't that impactful on children across the board and younger people. And I think that's the thing that really confused me with the mandate on it. It just felt like it still could have been a choice for the people that needed it, and as well for the ones that maybe didn't need it as much.
So that makes me then think about, and this goes to the better question of like the politicians who are making these rules, like who's advising them? Is it a meritocracy? Is it the smartest people who are advising these politicians? I don't think so. Are these wise people? I don't think so. Are these people who are giving multiple perspectives and ideas? Doesn't seem like that. Maybe for some of our politicians, but like the overall big decisions that were made, when we see the big decision makers like Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci at the NIH and CDC, the NIH and CDC, there was just like one viewpoint. And that's really, really disturbing. Why is that? I think it goes back to that. We were talking about mindful eating. Let's talk about mindful decision making and just being mindful in general. To be non-reactionary. The idea of wanting to, especially when there's an emergency that happens, people feel reassured when their leaders are quote unquote doing something about it. And the leaders themselves, I feel reassured when they're taking action. We're going to implement this program. We're going to do this. We're going to control this. But anything I've learned in my mindfulness training and in my mindfulness path of being a whole person and being more mature and wiser is often you need to just be. And you need to then you see the picture so much more clearly. More data comes in, more ideas come in, you start getting more perspectives. But what we saw very clearly, now we have evidence at the beginning of this pandemic, is that the government shut down opposing viewpoints and opposing voices. And they followed one narrative. And that narrative then ended up doing what you said. is that everybody has to follow these rules. Everybody has to get this done to them. If you want to work in the federal, government, you're going to have to get this shot. You're going to have to, follow these rules. You're going to have to wear this mask, without stopping and saying, well, what's the data behind masking? Is it as clear cut? Why, what's the, and there was
not.
also a lack of right. Do we have all the evidence? And and this is one thing I learned in public health school is so important. Like the interventions always come at a cost. So you have to know what the cost of your interventions are long-term. I didn't hear that at all. What is the cost of closing down schools for months and months and months? What is the cost of working from home? Sure, it's good for some people, but one of my friends who's a primary care doctor, she said, every other patient, this is in the beginning of the pandemic, she told me every other patient I'm sending to behavioral health. So 50% of the patients she saw, what's behavioral health is mental health services, psych. People were going crazy because it was so new. Their routines were interrupted. Did anybody think about those long-term costs? There were papers being published that talked about that, but those people were ostracized. Those people were vilified, including in my physician Facebook groups. I couldn't even have a conversation about those studies because people were so indoctrinated into thinking that was the one way. Whatever the CDC said, that was the way to do it. It's really devastating when you think about it.
Well, it's even more evident, at least to me, with the recent, with Elon taking over Twitter, the Twitter files kind of coming out, and some of the reports that kind of really do show how the government is, pressuring and putting pressure on social media platforms to control, certain speech on there, which I think across the board, even outside of medical, gets very, very dangerous in general. And
yeah, but it's also illegal, right? The government can't be colluding with private businesses to censor to censor citizens. It's illegal.
should be. Depends. Yeah. Do we really live in a democracy? I guess is the question.
Right. I mean, Fauci did it. Francis Collins did it. They were looking to find ways to silence people, doctors that they didn't agree with.
Yeah. I also have to ask you while you're on here, because I'm sure you're much more knowledgeable on this than myself. How worried should I be about these drug companies doing gain of function stuff and something breaking loose? Because I know that's a topic that wasn't allowed to be discussed, but it does seem more likely that's probably now 2 years later. It seems more likely.
Did you see the Project Veritas where they basically were talking about it? What did they call it? They called it some sort of guided evolution, or I forgot what the phrase they called it. They didn't call it gain of function. They called it guided evolution.
Well, that's happened a few times. Whenever they think there's something that they want to change the narrative of, they've done this a few times where they just change the definition of it. And
right. Or just change the name. It'll just sound nicer. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
It's evolving, right? It sounds like a good thing. I would be very concerned because I don't trust people enough to be responsible. Right. Like the guy who's on the Project Veritas, who was like one of the top people, at Pfizer, he's saying I was lying, basically to make up for the reasoning that for why he was saying the stuff he was saying. He said I was lying to impress my date. I looked at that guy. I was like, that's not making you look any better, dude. It's actually making you look like a worse person. You're lying to a potential life mate, right? Like that's just like low quality, low vibration type of behavior. That's not the kind of person who's like a wise, responsible, caring person. You're not conscientious. You're not caring. And you're the person who's part of the leadership at Pfizer, right? You're a liar. You're not going to be conscientious. You're not going to be on top of it. And I have no trust in them. I think that there's people working at Pfizer who are conscientious, who are caring, who want to do the good thing. But in my experience, those types of people don't rise to the top positions of power.
That's very true.
Right. That's because we tend to have more sociopathic tendencies. People with more sociopathic tendencies tend to rise to those positions of power. Not all the time, but often, because they're willing to be the type of person to make those ethical concessions in life and humanistic concessions so that they minimize really promoting humanity and ethics to get to where they are, to make the big bucks, to be in leadership.
Oh man. So where do we go? Where do we go from here? What's happening with, let's start there. What's happening with the lawsuit in 2098?
Okay, so let's end on a good note. So what happened is, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, Matthew, taking personal responsibility and saying, I'm a small person. This is my circle of control. What can I do? So that's what I did. What I've been doing in my life is I turned my life around, like taking action. And then as you do that, your circle of control grows. And as your circle of control grows, then, I joined the lawsuit and we'd spotted in court and stars aligned. We went to the hearing, our first hearing. This was on January 23rd, 2023. I'm working with fabulous people, by the way. Janine Muniz is our lawyer from the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which is the legal nonprofit you could donate to. My co-plaintiffs, Aaron Kiriati, Tracy Beth Hoog, Pete Mazalewski, and Ram Durasetti are just fabulous, so brilliant, so ethically minded, and they're doing this for all the right reasons. So we went to court, and the judge heard our case.
How many physicians are a part of this, by the way?
So there's a couple lawsuits. The one our lawsuit is 5 physicians. There's another lawsuit that was 2 physicians that their judge basically threw their case out, and or they lost their case and they're appealing. That judge's decision I read, I was like mind boggled. I was like, really? This is his thinking, but I don't want to disparage him any further, but I didn't agree with his decision is what I'm going to say. But our judge came out, and there was another lawsuit that we actually tag team with, which was with the Children's Health Defense Fund and Physicians for Informed Consent. They had their lawsuit. So our lawsuits were heard at the same time with the state arguing, and our judge basically in the middle of the hearing, he was like 84, 85-year-old man. This is what I'm talking about. Conscientious, critical, deep thinking people is what we need. In the middle of the hearing, the Deputy Attorney General said, well, Judge, I think we can all agree here that the definition of misinformation is very clear. And he interrupted her. He said, no, the definition of misinformation is not clear. The definition of misinformation is nonsense. And I was so happy to hear those words because I said, finally, someone gets it. Like they get it. And he said, so then 2 days later, he comes out and he grants us a preliminary injunction, which means that while he's making his final decision, the state can't act against us and enforce this law against us. And in his preliminary injunction, he basically said, this law doesn't make sense. He didn't say this law is nonsense. He said that in court, but he basically said in his preliminary injunction decision that the law is too vague, that that the term consensus is not clear. Like what kind of consensus? Formal consensus, informal consensus? What's contemporary consensus? Is that in the past 2 months? Is it in the past 6 months? That it gives so much power to the state, and that it was grammatically incorrect as well, which is what I thought, so many months ago when I read this law and thought it was ridiculous. So we're going to be waiting to hear his final decision. And I've heard that the state is not planning on appealing if they lose, because I think they're strategizing to win another lawsuit for the same law that they think they have a higher chance of winning. So basically, they think they have a higher chance of losing ours, so they want to go support the suit and pursue the suit that they think they have a higher chance of winning because they think the other opposing side is not as strong. So I think they're too scared of us. But that kind of shows you the strategizing involved in legal maneuvering involved in how potentially we, even though our lawsuit is so strong, that the law could still be the law of the land. In any case, I'm going to be on this. I'm going to be working on it with my lawyer, with my amazing co-plaintiffs, and using opportunities like this conversation with you, Matthew. Thank you so much, to get awareness to the people that they have to be aware of increasing authoritarianism in medicine, decreasing autonomy, the wearing away of the patient-doctor relationship by governmental forces that want society to be in a way that's not really truthful. And I really urge everybody listening to be savvy about this stuff.
And quick question about the strategy there. If they're pursuing this other lawsuit more aggressively because they have a better chance of winning it, is there thought that by winning that lawsuit that the judgment in that lawsuit would supersede the judgment in your lawsuit if you come out victorious?
I think that's the thinking. I think that's the belief. So, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. I have to figure out more specifics, and but I think that's the idea, is that they want to win that other lawsuit, so it becomes the law of the land.
So tell people, we want to inform them on this. Where can they learn more about this, AB 2098, if they live here in California, and how to get, more active about it and educate themselves, and also just in general about their, education on their own health and how to become knowledgeable on that, and obviously connect with you?
So there's a bunch of great organizations in California that are promoting medical freedom, the sacred relationship between parents and children, and also bodily autonomy. So organizations that I really enjoyed learning from are things like the Unity Project. Children's Health Defense Fund has a good newsletter where you can kind of get updates. They have, of course, very anti-authoritarian slant. So you have to be a savvy consumer of your information, right? But these are two sources. Freedom Angels is a very grassroots organization that I follow and I love and I support. There's two ladies who've been super active against SB 866, which was the bill that would lower age of consent for vaccination to 12. So I love Freedom Angels, and they're going to still be active, and you can get involved with them and do grassroots campaigning at the Capitol if you wanted to. And they're just awesome ladies. And then people can follow me. I'll be giving updates on AB 2098 on my Twitter account, and that's at Azadeh Khatibi, AZADEH KHATIBI. And then I'm on Instagram at Dr. Azadeh Khatibi, DrAzadehKHATIBI. And we're also going to be making a film. Our production company is making a film about the journey of this lawsuit and the people involved, and then against the larger backdrop of the increasing biomedical security surveillance state and increasing authoritarianism. So please follow along, and we'll tell you all about that. Again, AZADEHKHATIBI.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me this morning about this. It certainly helps having these conversations. I think you touched on something that's really essential there. When getting information, so much information, especially online, it is slanted a little bit one way or the other. You do have to be, inject some sort of rational thought behind as you're processing that information. If it's right-leaning, acknowledge it's right-leaning. If it's left-leaning, acknowledge it's left-leaning. I'm a big believer in talk to a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives, take in news and information from a lot of different perspectives, boil it all down, filter through it, and see what is left and that's consistent through all those stories. It's a lot of work, but that's, how you'll find out where the bits of truth really are and separate out all the noise.
Yeah. And I think as you get to know yourself and have a deeper connection to yourself as well, you just start feeling on an intuitive basis, this doesn't sound right. This does sound right. Right. But I think, you need to learn how to be savvy before you start doing that too. It's kind of hard, I think, for most people because they're so busy working.
Yes.
It's hard I know when I was constantly working, I didn't even have time to think about what was going on in my own life, let alone what was going on in the world. I was just reacting to the news as I was driving home. Right. So to consciously create space and time for yourself and connection to yourself. And then also have some time to kind of get to know different perspectives and different people just in your own social circle. And that I think has a lot of long-term positive health impact by spending time with yourself, spending time with others. And then that also bleeds into you becoming more aware of what's going on and having different perspectives just because you're interacting with other people. And then you're also having time cultivated to just be as opposed to working or reacting all the time, for what it's worth.
I think that's a beautiful, beautiful message to leave on. Beautiful way to end this episode. So again, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate everything that you're out there doing and having this conversation and making it, more public. It'll certainly, at least if nothing else, make people more aware and more educated on these topics. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate it, and many blessings to you and your audience. Thank you for your time. I hope to keep you updated as this progresses.
Likewise, I'll definitely be following.